Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. After a week-long round of talks last week between the chief US negotiator Zalmay Khalilzad and the Taliban delegation in Doha, we have the core elements of a deal. The Taliban have stated that they will not let Afghanistan's territory be used by international terrorist groups, and the United States has agreed to withdraw its forces. Beyond this, questions remain. What will be the US withdrawal timeline? A few months, which is what the Taliban want, or a year to 2 years, which the US would be looking for. The first is infeasible for the US. The second could pose a problem for Taliban in terms of selling the deal to their cadres. Would the US want to keep a small tripwire force? Will the Taliban agree to negotiate with the Afghan government? President Ashraf Ghani, wary of the negotiations, has already said the key to peace in Afghanistan lies in Pakistan, implying that the Taliban are kept away from talking to Kabul by Pakistan. Will the US troops stay until the details have been worked out? Or will the Taliban make a detailed deal contingent on a full US withdrawal? Critics already say that a withdrawal before a full deal is worked out would mean US departure while the Afghan government and people are left on their own to face the Taliban. How will the negotiations interact with Afghanistan's presidential elections in July 2019? Will the Taliban be allowed to run its own candidates despite the registration deadline having passed? Will the elections be postponed until an Afghan peace deal is struck with an interim government created in the meantime, including strong Taliban representation? The idea has already been mooted, but predictably Ghani, who would lose power in any such arrangement, is fiercely opposed to it. Ghani's own chances of winning over 50% in July's presidential elections are slim. His government is unpopular and isolated. He has suffered defections of political allies, key power brokers, and constituencies. 17 other candidates are running for president. 2 rounds of elections are thus very likely if the elections happen on time. This is just the tip of the iceberg in a situation where things could still go south. To discuss these questions and many others, we have with us Tanya Goudsouzian, a former opinion editor at Al Jazeera, and Yousafzai, who's the resident editor of the news and based in Peshawar. Let me begin with Tanya here. Tanya, you wrote an article on 31st Jan titled, "Who Talks with Afghanistan?" So the first question is, how do we define Afghanistan? When you refer to Afghanistan, are you referring to the government in Kabul, or are you referring to an insurgent force with which, quote unquote, the occupation force is now forced to talk to?
That's a very good question. I think we have to move away from this binary way of looking at it. It isn't just Taliban and the Afghan government. You had Zalmay Khalilzad who said that the Afghan voice was there. Which Afghan voice is the question? There are many voices, and one of the main issues is that there is no consensus in Afghanistan on how to proceed, how to bring peace to the country. Right now, Zalmay Khalilzad, the US envoy, is talking to the Taliban, but really only to the Taliban. This has raised many, many questions. Why this particular group? Why not involve the Afghan government? They have basically acquiesced to Taliban demands to leave the Afghan government out of it. But whether you like it or not, the Afghan government is the elected body. That is the government that the Afghan people elected, and leaving them out of the process is a major flaw in the US Taliban talks, or as they're calling it, the Afghan truce. What Afghan truce if only one party is involved?
Okay. So let me go back to your article where you are quoting Barnett, a former US diplomat and expert on Afghanistan who helped open secret negotiations with the Taliban in 2007, 2010 and 2011. I'm quoting from your article. And he says, and I quote, they will be involved at the next stage on political, this is the Kabul government, arrangements in Afghanistan. They'll also have their own demands and proposals about the troop withdrawal and CT counterterrorism guarantees. So Reuben is saying that this is a phased process. Frankly, what we have right now is essentially the pre-negotiation phase. And one of the basic reasons the US is talking to the Taliban is because that is a viable insurgent force which controls directly or indirectly at least 50% of the territory in Afghanistan. And because there is mission creep as far as the US is concerned. So obviously they will have to begin with that. And for the Taliban, it is very clear, like all insurgent forces across the world through various phases, that they will talk to what they describe as the occupation force and not a government that has been put up or has come into being in consequence of a particular invasion of an occupation force. So that makes clear sense to most of us.
I wouldn't exactly agree. Yes, it is true. Dr. Rubin did say that this is the first phase of what's probably going to be a drawn-out process and that the Afghan government will be brought into the talks. But simply by beginning this way, what they have done is in many ways feed into the perceptions, as I say in my article, that they are delegitimizing the elected government of Afghanistan. If you start negotiations with Daesh and you leave out the Syrian government, I mean, it would be almost the same as that. What I'm saying is that
Daesh never controlled Syria. The Taliban did, and when the US invaded Afghanistan, they actually ousted the Taliban. And obviously this was a time when there were at least 3 countries that had recognized the Taliban government, namely Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Pakistan. So yes, to the extent that they did not have a presence in the United Nations, yes, one could say that they were not a legitimate government, but they were the de facto government in Afghanistan. So I guess the sort of connection or the analogy bringing in Daesh is kind of stretched, isn't it?
What I'm trying to tell you is that leaving the Afghan government out of the process has basically meant that they are giving precedence to the Taliban's conditions. Why is the Taliban setting the conditions for the first phase? This is a major criticism leveled at the talks
because they are the major threat because they are the major force countering the US as well as the US backed government in Kabul. That's why.
And what this leaves you is, as I say in the rest of my article, it leaves you in a situation where you have the US envoy in a de facto way representing the Afghan voice, which is not right. So what the Afghan government and other people, not just the Afghan government, even people who are critical of the Afghan government have cited this criticism that the Afghan voice is not the Afghan government voice, and other Afghan voices are not represented in these talks.
Tanya, when you use the term "this is not right," this is not about right or wrong. This is about dealing with a situation, regardless of how someone considers it, whether someone considers it right or wrong. It's dealing with the situation. It's a very clear problem. The US has tried over many years to work it out. They have not been able to do this. They now won't get out of there, so they don't have any option but to talk to the Taliban.
We also saw the American side make concessions, announce a troop withdrawal, but this was not followed by an announcement, a similar announcement of a concession on the Taliban's part. So you have to also see that this is feeding perceptions that
absolutely, I totally agree with you. But once again, when you come to the table, you want to play your hand, and the Taliban think that they have the space and they also have the time to play a tough hand. That's what is expected. So, it's not just about right or wrong.
Well, I'm telling you how this is playing out in Afghanistan. The way that this is in Afghanistan, it is instilling no confidence, not just in the Afghan government, but even critics of the Afghan government have said that the process is flawed. Why is it that their fate is being negotiated behind closed doors in outside countries while they are left clueless? What's going to happen to them? Why don't they have a say?
Okay, let me pull in Rahimullah Yousafzai on this. Rahimullah Yousafzai, you heard what Tanya was saying. Do you agree with her? What is your take on the talks and whether the other Afghan voices should be included at this stage or can be included at this stage of the negotiations?
The problem was that Taliban were not seeking negotiations, but the Americans wanted to talk to them. So this was, an offer being made to Taliban since long. The Afghan government has been making an offer of talks for the last many years. Taliban were not agreeing to talk to the Afghan government. They had repeatedly said they will only talk to the Americans. And the Americans, because they seemingly want to leave Afghanistan, so they agreed. So they have accepted a Taliban condition. And now when you accept Taliban condition, Taliban say we will first talk to the Americans regarding the withdrawal of foreign forces. And once that is out of the way, we can talk to the Afghan government, although they have been saying since long, the Taliban I mean, that they are willing even at this stage to talk to Afghan politicians, tribal elders and religious leaders, but not the Afghan government as such. So, the Taliban condition has been accepted by the Americans. Now you can criticize that. You can say, why did the Americans do that? Why didn't they insist that the Afghan government should become involved in the talks as well? But I think it is a position of weakness from which the U.S. is negotiating, from which the Afghan government is offering talks to Taliban. Taliban have this, edge, or you can say Taliban are in a stronger position, and that's why everyone is offering them talks, and they are putting their own conditions. But I believe that, eventually Taliban would have to negotiate also with the Afghan government, because there is no other way for having
Is it likely, Rahimullah Yousafzai, is it likely in the next phase for the Taliban to insist, and this could be one way of circumventing this pressure that they have of not talking to, as far as their cadres are concerned, of not talking to Kabul, to actually call for a loya jirga? Because, as you very rightly said, they have been talking to various voices and groups inside Afghanistan. So the loya jirga could be one mechanism in and through which this could be worked out.
The loya jirga isn't something about which there's a consensus. Loya jirga in recent times has been manipulated. It has been used by every government, whether it was Dr. Najibullah's communist regime in 1987, the loya jirga which I attended in Kabul, whether there was a loya jirga called by Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani when he was made the president under the Peshawar Accord for 4 months, and he continued for 4 years, and he called this loya jirga, giving it an Islamic name, Shura Halwaqt, in Kabul, and then getting their, support to stay in power beyond the 4 months.
Rahimullah Yousafzai, that this is very interesting. I'm sorry, I'm cutting into what you're saying, because we also have Dr. Omar Zakhilwal with us, the former Afghan ambassador to Pakistan and also the former finance minister Hamid Karzai's government. Dr. Zakhilwal, thank you so much. I know you have to go somewhere. So I just want to ask you about what your impression is of where the negotiations are, and of course also the criticism that is that's being mounting in relation to what are being described as closed door secret talks in which there are no other Afghan voices.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be on your program. First of all, there is not a lot of secret, actually. The main issues are being discussed openly as to what they are, what has been agreed so far with the Taliban, and what are the pending issues. At this stage, certainly, we should expect this to enable the further interactions that will take the discussion into details in deeper issues, which we are not there yet. But sometimes probably we just get ourselves ahead of the discussion. Okay. Our expectations at the very outset are probably excessive. Certain fears might be legitimate, and those also come into discussion. So there's a lot of talks out there that is not really the discussion of the negotiation at this stage, and yet it is out there in being circulated, and that creates lots of suspicions and doubts and fears. and you name.
I'm happy you talked about this, Dr. Zakhilwal. Give me a sense of what you think, because as you know, I was just talking to Tanya Goudsouzian also, who's on the panel, and listening to you, and she wrote an article on 31st Jan where she's spoken with various people inside Afghanistan and also outside Afghanistan, and most of the voices that she's quoted in the article from within Afghanistan are critical of how the Americans are going about this. Is that your impression also?
There is the discussion between the Taliban and the Americans is not a negotiation talks.
Okay.
These are talks that will enable intra-Afghan dialogue, which at the end we do not have an alternative to it for a final settlement. And this would also certainly facilitate certain steps, confidence-building steps on both sides that will make negotiations more resultful. So that's where we are. The two main issues already out there circulated accurately are that the Americans have expressed their commitment to troop withdrawal, where the Taliban have expressed their commitment to distancing themselves from international terrorism or elements that would threaten the U.S. and other Western countries or the rest of the world. But at the same time, of course, what has not yet been agreed upon is the modality of a possible ceasefire that will has to come into being at some stage, and also the modality of the intra-Afghan dialogue. Taliban have not rejected either, but it's only the modality with which an agreement has not been reached, or how it should be reached. And those are basically the issues. Every other issue that's been circulated is not a subject to discussion in Doha yet.
Okay. Dr. Zakhilwal, final question. Are you satisfied with the progress so far? Of course, there are fears that all of this could still go south, but given, and there have been previous attempts at these negotiations and talks, you think that this particular phase is different in terms of content and substance from previous attempts?
I want to sound overconfident. We can make case for both optimism, but I think the safer side would be to be cautiously optimistic for these talks. First, they are directly between Taliban and the U.S. This has been continuously a position of the Taliban that as a first is important, and that took place. And secondly, the most important issues that is on the Taliban's mind and that's on the U.S. mind are the first issues to be discussed and in fact agreed upon. So that is an important step. But certainly the devil is in the details, and there are a lot of details that have not even been discussed, let alone known. Once things start to unfold, details are discussed, the shape of the intra-Afghan dialogue, and also the environment. If the environment becomes tougher, particularly if violence picks up, it makes it difficult. So these trust-building measures are important.
So absolutely, at some point, a ceasefire will also be very important. Thank you so much, Dr. Zakhilwal, for speaking with us. Going back to Rahimullah Yousafzai before I go to Tanya. Rahimullah Yousafzai, you were talking about the various lawyer jirgas and how they've been used, and therefore they might not be as useful today as they'll probably be before they were exploited politically.
Yes, I think that, lawyer jirga was a great institution. And when there was no democracy, when there were no elections, so the lawyer jirga played a very important role at time of emergency and to take decisions of national importance. But I think that was the past. In the present time, we have a parliament in Afghanistan. And, the Lay Jirga is basically the people who attend the Lay Jirga are nominated by whoever is in power. And, these include elected people. They also include tribal elders, religious leaders, intellectuals. So, you can stuff your people, your supporters in the Lay Jirga and get the decisions you want. I doubt that Taliban would go along with that. Even if the Afghan government was to hold the Lay Jirga, to call the Lay Jirga, there will be, differences as to who is able to represent this area or this tribe or this, ethnic group. So there will be controversies. That's why I thought that,
So in which case, if we get to that point where there's an interim setup or a provisional setup, what would be the mechanism in and through which that would come into being?
Interim government will be formed then with consensus by both sides. So the Afghan government and the Taliban would have to negotiate. They will have agree on the names of the people. Both will, present their list, and maybe there will be some agreement on people who they think are neutral or acceptable.
But the people who are in the running and contestation for the upcoming elections, and of course the sitting government, as I said in my introduction, President Ghani is fiercely opposed to this idea of a provisional or an interim government. It's very unlikely that they would accept that.
Oh yes, that's very obvious, whoever is in power. Yeah. And right now we have two major candidates, who opposed each other in 2014, and they're again contesting against each other, and still they are allies in this national unity government. I mean Dr. Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah. And they don't want any interim government. They say they are the legal elected government and they will stay in power until their term ends. And that, 20th July is the election date. So I think it will be very difficult for the Americans to push this idea of an interim government. You have to maybe delay the elections again, already delayed for 3 months, and then you will have to seek agreement of all the major contenders for power and the people who are already in power and Taliban. So this is going to be a hard sell. But I think that a way has to be found, because without an interim government, I don't know.
Well, the million-dollar question is, what way is to be found? Of course, everyone agrees that something needs to be worked out, but the devil lies in the detail. And you talked about Loya Jirga, the problems with that mechanism, and then of course the fact that the current government and the various people who are in contestation are very unlikely to accept an interim or a provisional government. But stay with me, Rahimullah Yousafzai. Let me just hop across to Tanya. Tanya, you heard Dr. Omar Zakhilwal, and he was very clear that obviously there is a tendency, given various reasons, for the Afghans to jump ahead of the curve. And he seemed not as critical or despondent about this particular phase of talks as some of the people that you spoke with and whose voices found their way in your article.
No, of course, I listened to Dr. Zakhilwal's answer, and I wouldn't call it optimistic so much as I would call it cautiously optimistic. He made some interesting points. He'd basically say nothing has been agreed until everything's been agreed. Commitments have been made, but no actions have been taken. Nothing has been signed. No agreements have been made. Confidence-building measures, perhaps. You've had statements coming out from both sides. You have one side committing to a troop drawdown, but no date has been set. On the other side, you don't have any indication of any intention to announce a ceasefire. So I don't really see both sides making the same type of concessions. And this is not just myself, but obviously several people I've spoken to across the various divides in Afghanistan. As I pointed out, I'd also interviewed the younger brother of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who said, we are not opposed to talks with the Taliban. What we're opposing is the way the process is taking place. so that all victims of the war are not really taken into account. And giving priority, I believe it was our other panelist, Mr. Yousafzai, who pointed out as well, the Americans appear as though they're coming from a weak position, and that doesn't really bode well for the future, for the outcome.
Here's the thing, Tanya. I mean, since I read your article and the various people, the critics were talking about it, the common strand is that they're criticizing the way the talks are happening, but no one has really been able to give anything concrete on how it could be done in any other way given the situation on the ground.
An insistence to involve the Afghan government would have been a pretty constructive step. Several talks were held already, excluding this representative body. Several talks were already held. So when at some point down the line where there was a little bit of pressure to say, right, now's the time perhaps to bring the others in, it was met with resistance. So what I'm saying is that the process started off perhaps because there was no other option to bring the Taliban to the table, but at some point they had to be brought in. And so now we're the media is going, is all praising the outcome of these talks. What is the outcome exactly?
No, so
it doesn't seem to be...
leaving aside the hype that has been created in some sections of the media, the issue here is, let's try and do a bit of Occam's razor here, which is there's entity X and there's entity Y, and they've been fighting, and at some point, entity X says, well, there's mission creep, or call it what you will. We need to somehow get out of this. And then entity Y says, okay, we can sit down with you. We've actually been saying this to you for a long time, that we want to talk to you. There have been any number of letters, Eid letters, over several years that say this. But the one thing that we do not want to do, and we've constantly and consistently said that, is that we're not going to talk to Kabul because that's a puppet government. Now, entity X with its mission creep can either say, well, no, you have to accept that you have to talk to the Kabul government. In fact, that when we come to the table, we're going to bring some reps of the Kabul government and you'll have to accept it. Or they say, well, since we are in a hurry to get out, or in a relative hurry to get out, therefore, we have no option but to accept your condition that you're not going to talk at this particular stage with the Kabul government, but perhaps as a result of the opening of these talks, at some point, you will talk to them.
No, I think, as I told you before, they have done this at the expense of throwing the legitimate government of Afghanistan under the bus. By leaving them out, by acquiescing to Taliban demands, what they have done is to, in fact, reinforce perceptions that the Kabul government is a puppet government. As I said, that does not bode well.
I agree with you. But here's the thing. What is the option, especially when they want to get out?
But we went over this. The options were that they could have been done a little bit differently. At some point, they had to insist on a concession from
No,
The
I think they are. I think they are insisting.
Said we will draw down.
I think they are insisting that, talking to the Kabul government is not something which is off the table. I think it's on the table. But let me, since I have to wrap up, since I have to wrap up, let me ask Rahimullah Yousafzai what he thinks about whether the option is on the table or is it totally off the table.
No, I think the Americans in every meeting, as far as I know, they are telling the Taliban that it has to be an intra-Afghan dialogue.
Correct.
And, you have to settle your political problems with the Afghan government regarding the presence of foreign troops, security issues that we can discuss, and we accepted your demand. I think, and you have also maybe, read the statements coming from Pentagon and coming from Zalmay Khalilzad. They are saying that, these two issues are very critical. Taliban agreeing to a ceasefire and then also talking to the Afghan government. Without that, there can be no withdrawal of U.S. forces. Correct. So I think these are conditions put up by the Americans. They just wanted to start the dialogue to let Taliban believe and realize that their demand has been accepted. But there are issues which can be discussed with the Americans, but not all the issues. you have to dialogue with the Afghan government for settling those issues. So
I dare say that the Taliban realize that.
They do, I think they do. And that's why they are saying, in a way, indirectly, yes, we are talking to the Afghan politicians, tribal elders, religious scholars, they may be part of the government or they may not be part of the government, but we are ready and we have been talking to them as well. So I think, this is just a matter of principle as far as Taliban are concerned. For the last 17, 18 years, they have not recognized the Afghan government. Correct. They still believe it is a puppet government and they believe it is powerless. So I think that is the hurdle now facing the Taliban. They do realize that the Afghan government is a reality and they will have to settle issues concerning Afghanistan's future, the constitution, the release of prisoners. All these issues would have to be settled by the two sides, I mean the Afghan government and Taliban.
Okay. Thank you so much, Raheem Yousafzai, Tanya Goudsouzian, giving us their perspective on the ongoing process between the US and the Taliban, and of course, the various other factors that need to be worked in order for this process to not go south and sideways. We shall take a short break, and at the other end of the break, we will look at India's jobless growth. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Reports from India suggest that the BJP government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi has a dismal record when it comes to job creation. There's persistent unemployment leading to despondency among India's youth. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy found that there are about 31 million unemployed youth in India as of February 2018. According to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development survey findings, more than 30% of Indians in the 15 to 29 years age group are either unemployed or they are not in education training. Even the International Labour Organization report, which was titled World Employment and Social Outlook Trend 2018, projected that the number of unemployed persons in India is expected to rise from 18.6 million in 2018 to 18.9 million by 2019, making it the home of 10% of the world's jobless people. So what's going on? To discuss this, we have with us Nishant Verma, a political analyst, and Muzzamil Thakur, who's also a political analyst. Let me begin with Mr. Verma. Mr. Verma, give us a sense of, because, as far as the macro indicators are concerned, the general, obviously, the outlook for India is, India's growth is very well. But why is it jobless growth?
This is a big problem out here in India. This is doubtless, and it has been a persistent issue since many years now. The current government, I would not say has tried much. They have tried a little, but then it has been a failure in terms of creating jobs. There are several parameters to that and several indicators and factors because of which this has not been possible. I think they are in the last phase of governance, and why they have not been able to do can be still discussed. But what will happen after these elections, general elections which are due in next couple of months, will be dependent on whosoever makes the new government here.
But Mr. Verma, one of the things that Mr. Modi was said to have done in Gujarat when he was the chief minister there was to develop that state. But even then, critics used to say that this was a development that wasn't really taking care of people who were below the poverty line or not pulling people up. And so this was essentially the kind of development where the ruling party and big business were in tandem, but that wasn't doing much for the people of Gujarat. Was that sense correct? Is that something that is now replayed at a larger level, at the all India level?
Haider Saab, add me to the list of critics that you have who said so, because I live in Gujarat. You are getting me here right today from Ahmedabad itself. I've been in Gujarat for nearly 3 decades. Okay. And the many number times in Indian media. So whatever the Gujarat model was propagated in 2014 prior to elections in the name of Mr. Modi's vibrant Gujarat and development was all fake. When you land up here in Gujarat, you come to know that in last 22 years, in fact, Gujarat itself has gone down the lane in terms of development, and thanks to his meaningless governance, because it was never nothing but other than propaganda. Vibrant Gujarat is only a phrase that has been used for propaganda. Gujarat per se has, come down heavily on MSME sector, on even the large industry sector. The unemployment had grown here even under his chief ministerialship, and the poverty lines have not been taken control of. There are n number of issues which were not taken care by him.
Mr. Verma, I'm going to come back to you. Thank you for being so honest. And frankly, between you and me, this is not just the story of India. This is a story of, unfortunately, the story of this region. But Muzzamil Ayyub Thakur, talking about jobless growth, you're obviously based in a very troubled state, a state which has seen a lot of oppression ever since Mr. Modi came to power. Is this joblessness, unemployment also a story in Kashmir?
It is completely to do with the right to self-determination. Now, we may look at that in terms of azadi, of freedom, but what exactly does that freedom entail? It means the right to self-determination as granted and agreed upon by both the governments of India and Pakistan and ratified by the United Nations. The jobs and the reformation of industries and the general socio-economic situation in Kashmir is irrelevant. The consequences of occupation is the fact that there are no jobs, that there are no hospitals that are active, that can offer first-class services. This is what the priority is in Kashmir.
Okay, Muzzamil, I completely agree with you. As far as the right to self-determination is concerned, it's an inalienable right. So therefore, it's one of the fundamental rights of all human beings. But one of the arguments that is often been made by analysts in India is that elections are regularly conducted at the municipal level also, at the state level also. People participate in the elections and they want to be governed properly. They do need jobs, they do need the infrastructure and the rest of it. And therefore, and from there, the deduction is that they want to be part of India. But forgetting that, clearly, joblessness or unemployment, regardless of the right to self-determination, must be a big problem in Kashmir, is it?
Of course, financially, people are not as well off as the rest of the subcontinent. But at the same time, you have to remember our economy is completely based on the occupation in itself. So when you have the apple orchards or the cherry pickers or the walnuts or the water, I mean, the entire economy of Kashmir is dependent on what happens with the occupation, what happens when people are being killed. You have shutdowns and crackdowns and curfews constantly. You have, on average, a recent civil society reported that on average 3 people killed every day, 1 person every 8 hours. Now, the reason I'm giving you these figures is because when we talk about economy, you have to remember that when a person is killed every 8 hours, there will be a reaction on the ground. What kind of prosperity would there possibly be? And we still seem to be dancing around this idea that the elections, people want to go to the election, people want to elect somebody to, but this is about good governance. This is about governance of the state on the one side. But on the other side, the majority of the people expect that those people that are representing them, those people that are representing the electoral sentiments, will include the sentiment of azadi as well, will include the fact that these represent...
So Muzzamil, so has the state been governed properly, leaving aside for a while the right to self-determination, issue?
Nepotism is at the peak. You have two different families that have been ruling Kashmir for the last 70-odd years, which is on the one side you have the Mufti Sayyid's family, and the other side you have the Sheikh Abdullah family, the dynasties, what we call them. Complete nepotism, as we have seen in the rest of mainland India.
And so both these parties have been, until recently, PDP was in coalition with the BJP. The NC has been in multiple coalitions with the Congress. And these are the two big all-India parties. and yet nepotism and jobbery has been going on. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Nepotism, corruption on such a grand scale. I think we have 80,000 crore is the budget of Kashmir, and only 35,000 is used. And the rest of the money has to, you have to understand, each state that gets its funding has to use it. If you don't use it, then the next year, what happens is your budget gets, it gets cut. So, and this, I'm pretty sure this happens with most of the subcontinent, but with Kashmir, the problem is that when you have an 80,000 budget and you're only using less than half of it, what happens to the rest of that money? I mean,
precisely, I was about to ask you, where does that money go?
Into the back pockets of friends and families, contractors, the rest of mainland India. It's corruption. The subcontinent has a big problem, and Kashmir is not an anomaly where it doesn't happen as well.
Okay, back to Nishant Verma. Mr. Verma, is that the story in other states also? Budgets not entirely being utilized, and money, and the whole idea of nepotism and the rest of it?
Nepotism is a universal problem, if you may say. It has got nothing to do only with the Jammu and Kashmir that we're talking about. Largely talked about the 80,000 crores being sanctioned and 35,000 crores being used. This varies annually. But then I would like to make an add-on to what Muzzamil Saab is saying, and that necessarily does not mean agreeing to his point of view. See, if 35,000 crore is only what is being used, the rest is not going into anyone's back pocket. When it is used, then the corruption comes in. If I buy something worth 10 rupees at a cost of 100, so I'm using 100. Hence, 90 rupees may be corruption, and finally I purchase 10 the material that I want. So rest of the money is unused is probably what he's trying to say. But then there are several factors. First of all, Kashmir is governed by 3 different entities. India is governing a segment of it, Pakistan is governing a segment, and certain is under the China's belt. Now, it also depends which Kashmir are we talking about. We're talking about the Indian part of it. Yes, I suppose the current Indian part of it is very well to do as compared to the rest 2 siblings that it has controlled by Pakistan as well as China.
Okay, hold on. Since I happen to come from the second sibling of Kashmir, I can assure you that it is not as what you're projecting it to be in terms of all the indices, but we're not going to get into that because this is not a program per se on Kashmir. It's essentially about the idea of looking at the sort of differential between the macro indicators that are presented vis-a-vis India's growth and some of the realities on the ground, and trying to figure out how and why that is happening. So going back to what you said about your own state, is that the story of other states also, or because that was essentially presented as a model?
Okay, yes. Now there are 3 different kind of at large, on a larger scale, 3 different type of states which you will find in India. One which are completely dependent on the farming, and farming is what gives them the produce and the benefit. Number 2 is industrial, or maybe industries plus farming. And the third are smaller states, certain which actually do not yield out of either farming or industries. So a common story cannot be, first of all, narrated. More or less, states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Maharashtra, these are more towards the industrial side, as well as it also has a farming sector. But primarily the funding or the government benefits and reaps the taxes from the industries part of it. Now, industries is not something that started yesterday. Since 1947, and I think prior to that, when we were united location, we already had a lot of industries which had come in. So per se, India has been growing on the industrial front. It has its own minuses, that is no doubt about it. But on the industrial side, the fall is not that much when we talk of the large industries. The moment we come to the smaller side, MSME segment and the micro segment of industries, that is taking a back hit from various governments, not only Mr. Modi's government, various governments, because of the policy paralysis.
But we're talking about Modi government because, you know, when he became the Prime Minister, one of the things that was constantly said was that there was the Gujarat model, and that model will now be replicated across India, and that he is someone who is going to, get people, upwardly mobile, and he's going to do a lot of development and the rest of it. But now that I look at the Indian media itself and the Indian analysts and economists, they're telling me a different story. Some are a little more critical, others are not that critical, but most of them say that it hasn't really panned out in the way that people expected it would.
Okay, now I must add here that outside India, there are two types of viewers or observers. One pro-India and one pro-Modi. That kind of a thing happened. So when Mr. Modi and BJP was in the run-up for election in 2014, a lot of media within India also was projecting him to be the next person who's going to develop India further. Now that was being picked up by the international media in order to say that this is what India's hopes and chances are if BJP and Mr. Modi gets elected. Now today what is happening is, because of the reason that India has not done so well under his governance, I personally need not shame India at all, but keeping the facts out here, that India has not done at all any good in the replication of Gujarat model, as I narrated that it is a failure, has happened in India. Now, if someone wants to, nitpick, can nitpick today's reports that are only showing his negatives. Definitely there are his negatives and the current government's negatives. And my underlying statement is that this current government has actually failed India in terms of development.
Thank you so much. That was Mr. Nishant Verma talking to us. Before I wrap up, I'm going to go back to Muzzamil Thakur. Muzzamil, I was a little amused when Nishant Verma said that Azad Jammu and Kashmir is worse off compared to occupied Kashmir, considering that I come from that area. But going back to nepotism and what he said about the money not going into the back pockets, is there something you want to add to that before I wrap up?
I think I'll have to first agree with you about Azad Jammu and Kashmir being much better off. I've been to both sides. I come from the Indian occupied side and I've visited Azad Kashmir several times, so I can agree with you with that. But in terms of nepotism and corruption, there is accuracy in what he says, that the rest of the money is not necessarily being put into back pockets. But we also have to remember that if you don't use the entire budget, the year after, your budget is reduced. So I would say that it isn't just 90 rupees on the 100 rupees that are being corrupted on. I would say that it's the entire amount that is being used. And you also have to remember that the army exists in Kashmir. There is corruption within the army, within the state, within the government.
They have also occupied prime real estate in many parts of Kashmir.
Absolutely. We're talking about billions of dollars worth of damage, not only just damage, but the occupation in itself. When you have farmlands and you have saffron fields and you have apple orchards and people are unable to earn their living from these places because of the occupation in itself, then you have a major problem. It's not just real estate.
And the state governments have not been able to evict the Indian security forces from the lands that they actually occupy, even though reports suggest that many of those lands being occupied illegally.
Absolutely. Not many, all of the land that is being occupied is completely illegal. This is not going back to the last 2 or 3 years. This is not happening in the last 10 or 15 years. We're talking about since the day the occupation happened. So they have been occupying real estate constantly and abusing their powers to the hilt.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Muzzamil Ayyub Thakur. Fortunately, that's all the time I have for the program today. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.